Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to part 3 of the TechTalk series, using the Power Platform to extend finance and operations. Today's topic is Power Automate. My name is AJ, and I will be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of the recorded session, please disconnect at this time. Closed captioning will be available in the following languages: Spanish, French, German, Italian, Chinese, and Russian. To turn on closed captioning, click on the gear icon found in the lower right-hand corner of the video pane. From the pop-up menu, click on Caption/Subtitles and select your language from the options that appear in the drop-down menu. The recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for your presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Profit, Senior Program Manager, Chris Scardy, Senior Program Manager, and Murray Fife, Principal Technical Specialist. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, AJ, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm super excited to dive into Power Automate with you in this series, and we have put together a number of fantastic demos for you today that I'm super excited to share. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Profit. I'm a Senior Fast Track Solution Architect based out of Denver, Colorado. I invite you to follow me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn, or follow my blog at dynamics365lady.com. Taking a look at what we're going to cover in today's session, we are going to look at a number of examples of Power Automate flows that are going to be leveraging your finance and operations app data that work with workflows, alerts, instant flows, and OData actions. We're also going to review some examples and talk a little bit about some flows that leverage finance and operations apps data that are related to custom business events and some scheduled flows. For each one of the flows that we're talking about, we're going to discuss tips and tricks for each of those Power Automate flows that we are demonstrating. Just a couple housekeeping items for you so that you're aware. All of our demonstrations today have been pre-recorded. So those videos have all been sped up, and we will be talking to those videos throughout this session. The full length normal speed recordings are going to be available with the recording of this session. We understand that they're a little fast and it might be a little difficult for you to follow, but to ensure that we could show you as many examples as possible and to fit all of these great demos in, we did need to speed them up a little bit for this session since we only have an hour. The other thing to note is that all of the examples that you're going to see today will, the solutions will be made available, and the links to those solutions and those full length normal speed videos will be made available as well with the recordings. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. For our first example, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Scardy, who is going to talk a little bit more about using Power Automate with workflow. Chris?
All right, thanks, Rachel. Yes, our first scenario is a classic. You can use Power Automate to handle the approval of a finance and operations workflow. In the example shown here, you can see an example of using a Power Automate flow to facilitate the approval of a purchase requisition. In this example, a Power Automate flow is triggered when the work items are created as part of the purchase requisition approval workflow. So we refer to that as the work item created event. This flow validates that the work item is ready for approval and then sends a Power Automate approval request to the assigned user. The user can then see that approval request in their email, on their phone via the Power Automate app, and of course inside of finance and operations as they normally would. The approval possibilities are endless, since that approval request can also be routed to other apps and services like Teams, as mentioned here in the slide, and text messages. The user can then use any of those mechanisms to review the information provided and approve. We've had a lot of positive feedback about the email approve requests capability in particular, and it has been especially popular with those customers and partners that remember the old Azure Service Bus feature from AX 2012. The flows triggered by the work item created event or any other business event can also take advantage of the 300 plus connectors in the Power Platform ecosystem to perform other actions like sending notifications to other users, sending data to other business systems, or kicking off other automated processes. Creating a Power Automate flow that facilitates approval of a finance and operations workflow is made really straightforward by a template that already has the appropriate steps to execute the validate and complete actions on the work item entity in finance and operations, and to send the approval request. Once you have that basic flow created, you can add other actions as needed, such as the extra notifications that we talked about, or sending the approval request to additional locations. The links at the bottom of the slide provide more information about enabling the scenario. Rachel, you can go to the next one. So the demo that we're going to be looking at is setup of a purchase requisition approval via Power Automate. We're going to examine the finance and operations workflow configuration, build an approval flow from a template, create the requisition and submit it, approve it via email, inspect the completed flow run, have a look at those values in there, and then review the approved requisition. All right, Rachel, you can play that. So maker setup of, where are you? So yeah, this is maker setup of purchase requisition approval via Power Automate. So the purchase requisitions, of course, are shown on the all purchase requisitions page. The purchase requisition review workflow is available from the procurement and sourcing workflows page. And we go into that workflow, and what we're going to do is just double check that the assignment includes me and that the completion policy is set to single approver for testing purposes, so that just a single approver can go in there and approve. We also want to make sure that the automatic actions are turned off, at least for testing purposes, so that we're catching all of those approval requests inside of Power Automate. So inside of Power Automate, we can search for that template. And then once we say, yes, we want to go, we set up the connections. And then inside of the template, it's just a matter of providing the instance or environment information. You can see it's got a really nice type ahead capability. So it's really easy to set the values. We set the business event to the approved purchase requisition, and then we just go through and set the instance on the validate work item action and the complete work item action. And you can see that complete work item action has dynamic content that is coming from the approval request and the outcome that the user gives. Now that flow is set up and ready to go, we can go back in. We've got a purchase requisition here for a Ford Ranger Lariat. We're going to submit that. And then in the comments box, we're just going to put a little comment in there. Great, and then sometime later we can come back and we can approve within finance and operations, or in this case, we're just going to have a look at the workflow history and see that the work items were assigned to all of those 3 users that we had set up in the workflow configuration. Now out in our email, we've got an approval request that we can go ahead and approve. We can also approve inside of the Power Automate portal or inside of the Power Automate app. We're going to add sure as a comment inside of that approval request in an email and then submit that. And we can see that a nice approved version of that email sits there so that you can see that. We can have a look at the flow run history. We can see those 3 flows kicked off for 3 different users. We'll have a look at this one that we just completed. You can see inside of that flow run history, we've got all of the values. You can see that work item owner is set to CGuardy. And then inside of the condition, we came down to the true branch. We can see all of the values inside of the approval request. And then we can see that execute action going into the complete action on the work items entity with that comment of sure. then we can go into the purchase requisition inside of finance and operations, refresh that, see that the status is set to approved. And then inside of the workflow history, you can see that comment being passed through and available inside of finance and operations for checkup purposes, for audit purposes as needed. Great, so that's the demonstration. So some things that I was reminded of and learned when I was coming up with this demo, just to kind of highlight those for you. So if you can't find the template that you need, you want to search for FinOps or Dynamics. Either one will kind of take you to that location, but FinOps is one of the easier ways. If you can't find the F&O instance or environment, ensure that the trigger and action connections have the correct user. So the ... on each trigger or action within Power Automate allows you to set the connection to a specific user. If you have multiple users that you are operating in the browser, it might pick up the wrong one, so just double check on those. You want to make sure that the workflow isn't completing automatically, so just disabling those automatic actions. You want to make sure that you can submit the workflow. So in some scenarios like that purchase or requisition one, you have to have a worker associated with the user and then have the appropriate roles. In that case, it was the employee role. And then you want to make sure that your work item is being assigned correctly. So double check the assignment type and the user. And then finally, just make sure that that completion policy is set appropriately. So in my example, it originally was set to multiple approvers, and you might need to switch that to single approver just while you're testing that out. So that's just some things to keep in mind as you're building a similar flow. So I hope you learned a little bit from that. I'll pass you over to Murray to demonstrate some alert rules.
Okay, so I really like the alert rules functionality that we've got within Power Automate and also Dynamics 365, because what Chris was showing were all the standard workflows that we have, but we don't have workflows for every trigger or every event in the system. So the alerts, which we have now within Dynamics 365, which are the same ones that we had in 2012, have the ability to trigger a Power Automate flow. So what that means is that we can go out and we could add alerts to tables. So when records are created or deleted, we can add alerts when anything is changed on the record, or when, for example, an individual field is changed, and then go out and process an alert based off this. So one of the examples that we sort of worked through with this scenario was going out and processing a vendor when they're created. So when a vendor's created, you may want to have automation associated with it. You may want to request a W9 from them. You may want to put items in SharePoint. You may want to notify people around that, and all of that is triggered off the one step, which is a vendor being created. So Rachel, if you want to move to the next slide. So what we're going to do in this is I'm going to go out and create an alert rule in finance and supply chain, and it's going to be based off the vendor. Then we're going to build a flow associated with this, and then send out an email to the vendor, and maybe do we could extend that out to do a lot more. So let's look at how we did this in the video. So for all of you that don't know how we create alerts, all we do is we go up to the options page and we just say, I want to create an alert. And the important thing is you need to set the send externally flag on this. So as soon as you set this up, then you'll see that we'll have a list of alerts that are running in the system. So now what we can do is we can just go into Power Automate and create an alert, and the category is alert. And this is pretty much all we need to do right now. I'll show you in a second how we go out and filter these out, but I'm just going to quickly run through this. I'm going at warp speed here, creating an email associated with it. And then what's going to happen is that when the alert gets triggered, when a new vendor gets created, then it's going to trigger that alert. Now, also what we'll see when we go into the business events catalog, we'll see that it's automatically creating these alert endpoints that are associated with the flow. So in the back end, it's creating that. We don't have to worry about that. So say, for example, I go out and I test this out. I can go out and create a new vendor. It's just going to, I've created the vendor now, and I can go back into Flow, into Power Automate. And within a couple of seconds, it runs and it actually says that an email's been sent. And now I've got a notification associated with it. Now, the one problem though is that business event, there's really only one alert type of business event. And all, if you create multiple alerts, then they'll all run at the same time. So what you can do is if you go into the settings for the alert, then you can add a trigger condition. And this is really important. And what I did here is I just said, if the this will only trigger when it's associated with a vendor table. So this goes out and allows you to not fire the flow unless it's a vendor table alert. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm going out and I'm creating another type of alert. And this one was when a field's changed. So in this case, when the 1099 box is flagged on the vendor. So when this runs, this returns back a payload. Now, what I found, and I'll talk about this later on with what I've learned, is that not all of the fields are available directly from the alert. So if I need to go out and get a record there from the system and use the object ID like I'm doing here, then I need to use that parse JSON step that I had in there. And I can go out and get a record, in this case a vendor record, and I can pass through the data area ID and the key, which is the vendor. And now I can go out and I can add an email associated with this. And in this case, I'm going to send an email with options to say, do I want to, do we need to approve this? Or I think actually here, I'm just going to send the email. So I'm going out and I'm looking up the primary email from the vendor because I've looked that up. I'm going to have a welcome message that's associated with it. And then also I'm going to add in the name from the vendor account and then add a polite body into this for the notification that the vendor has been onboarded at this point. So the key thing here is that parse JSON step, which I had earlier on, allows us to go and find the key field information. Then we can use that get record to go out and find the vendor record here. So we're going sort of triggering, and then we're doing a lookup from the key fields. So I'm just finishing off my email here. I'm going to take advantage of the rich text editor that's now inside the email component and bold the Contoso. And now when I go back, I'm just going to save this flow, and I'm going to go out and create a new vendor. And what we'll see is after I go out and create this, and then in this case, I'm going to add in the email account, because if I don't have the email, I can't have the Power Automate flow go out and send the email itself. So I'm going to create that, click save, which is going to be the trigger event now, which is going to start the flow running in the background. We can see that it's ran, it's running through, it's pulled up the email account for the vendor. And then if I go into my sent items, I can actually see the email that was created. So that what we went through with this flow was really a quick example of how we can go out and create an alert rule, have different types of alert rules, filter them out, and then start having automations around that, in this case, sending out an email. So I've been working with Power Automate and Flow for a while, but just like Chris was saying, we learned stuff as we go through, and what we're going to do is just review some of the tips that we want to sort of remind people. And there's a couple of things that can trip you up. So if you go out and create an alert trigger and it doesn't fire, then chances are you haven't set that external flag enabled. So that's just a starting point. Also, we have a scenario where we've got all of the alerts coming through one mechanism, which is this alert trigger. And we don't want all of them to run, because if you've got 10, 20, 100 of these, then you'll consume all of your quota within Power Automate. So that's where adding conditions to the triggers help. Now, also I need to look up specific records, and the key, previously, you didn't really get a lot of information from the payload that came through in the alert, but now we have the key fields, the table name, and a lot of information, even deep links inside the metadata for the schema for what's being passed through. So we can go out and, if you remember back, I used that parse JSON to find the key field, so I could go out and look up the record that I'm looking at. Now, the other thing is related to that is the event metadata for the alert trigger doesn't always pull through all the information, including the key fields. So the trick with that is to go out and use that parse JSON to surface all of the data. Something that tripped me up is I thought I'd be all clever and I'd turn on the organization-wide option, but then what that does is that doesn't allow me to send, turn on the send externally, which then stops the alert from running. And one other item that that we can point out is that sometimes we want to have a more complicated trigger condition. So what we can do is we can have multiple conditions in that settings for the trigger, and then that allows us to go out and only fire when very precise events are happening. So, for example, when you create the vendor, or if someone changes the 1099 field or the W9 required field, then only run the this type of alert when it's set to true, for example. So we can go out and create multiple conditions along the way. So hopefully these will give you all a little bit of a get over some of the hurdles that that we've come across as we're sort of creating these types of alerts. So I think Rachel, it's on to you.
Thanks, Murray. So in our next example, I'm going to be talking about an instant flow. So in my example, it's not a kind of retail type scenario. It'd be more in a manufacturing or engineering environment where you're doing a lot of R&D and you're not releasing a lot of products. But the idea behind these instant flows is that you can use these when you've got repetitive tasks or in situations where you can't create an alert rule. One of the restrictions on creating alert rules is that you can only create an alert rule for a primary data source in a form. It's also useful when there's no data entity for a particular piece of data in the system. So in my example, we actually have the user manually click a flow button. And the way I'm having the user do this is through a team site. So I created a team site with a channel in it. And I require the user to input the product ID that they have released. And then we create a new folder and copy some templates that are inside of there. And then from that point, you can really do anything you want using the 300 plus connectors that are available. One of the things to note with the instant flows is that in the current setup, a user does have to manually click that flow button in order to start it. In my example, I'm showing how to do that from a team site, but if you've got the Power Automate app on your cell phone, you can start a instant flow from there by adding a flow button. And if you do have an instant flow, you'll need to make sure that you share or invite others to the flow in order to allow them to use it. As a side note, we do have a new feature that is coming into finance and operations in that options tab. And this new automate menu is going to allow you to create instant flows from directly inside of finance and operations with context of the record that you're on. That will improve this instant flow scenario, but there's still a lot of great scenarios that you can do that are even outside of the system. So in my demonstration, I'm going to start out by adding a flow tab to my team site, and then we'll create an instant flow. I'll add steps into that flow to create SharePoint folders and to copy those files, add an approval step, and then I'll show you how to test and run that instant flow. So we'll go ahead and switch over to that video and take a look at it. So I'm here on that team site, and there's just the generic general channel, and you click that plus icon to add a tab. And in my case, I chose to add a flow tab. This will open up. If you don't already have flows, you'll see the templates. Otherwise, you can click that new icon to create a new flow. We're going to give it a name. In my case, I'm going to call it new product release, and then select the manually trigger a flow option. This will open up the flow right inside of Teams, and then I'm adding an input. So in my case, I wanted them to input that product number, so I'm updating the name and the description of what I want them to add. So then we add a new step to this flow, and here I'm going to make a connection to Dynamics 365. And in my case, I'm going to list the items present in the table. You'll need to choose the environment that you want to connect to. So I choose that environment. And then I need to choose the entity. In my case, I'm using the release products v2. And then I click on the advanced options. I need to filter this down because I don't want all of the items. In my case, I just want to get the item number that was entered into the kickoff of this particular flow. And then I'm also filtering it down so I only get one record. You could just as easily use a get record in this case if you know the object ID. So what I'm doing is I'm initializing a variable here, and I'm going to set that variable and save off the product description so that I can use that product description in later steps. So I scroll through the list of all the fields that are available in my release products v2, and in this case, I choose the search name field. You'll notice that when I did this, it put it into an apply to each loop. And the reason for that is because I used a list items present in table, and that's could return multiple records, even though I filtered it down. If you don't want it to do that, you can use the first expression to narrow it down, and that will tell the system that it's only going to be the first record. In this step, I'm creating the new folder, so I selected the SharePoint connector and then the create new folder, and I've selected the site, which is the same site that my team site is. So when you create a team site, it makes a SharePoint site behind the scenes, and the folder path in my case is general because that's the channel I'm creating this in, and then I put some dynamic information in for the actual folder name it's going to create. Then I'm adding a new step here to actually start to copy those files. So I navigate to the folder where my templates are at and choose the template. So this first step, I'm choosing the Word document template that I had created out there. And then I need to specify the destination folder. In this case, I want the destination folder to be the new folder that I created. So I'm selecting the full path of that previous step. And then I repeat this, and the kind of last step that you saw there is where I'm telling the system if the file already exists, then fail this action. So I'm repeating this, and this time all that's different is I'm choosing the Excel file. So again, I choose that full path from the previous step for my destination folder and select to fail this action. Then the last step here is I'm going to start and wait for an approval because I might need some sort of approval from my marketing team. So I put in those details here. I'm using dynamic information, so the product number that was input and the variable for that product description that we saved off, and adding some static text as well. I assign this to myself, the demo user that I'm using. And then I put in the message body of that particular email. So again, I'm using some dynamic fields with the product number and description, and then some static text to make that message a little bit more clear to the user as to what they're supposed to do. You can also add item links. In my case, I didn't do that, but now we're ready to test. So I click test and say I'm going to perform the trigger action. And the first time you run one of these flows, you'll have to confirm your connections. So I enter in the product number and click to run. And as soon as you click done, it will take you to that flow run where you can see the details of it running. Depending on your flow and how many steps are there, it might take slightly longer. But if I switch back over to the Files tab, you can see that my folder and my files were copied. Now, I went back to my Flow tab, and you can see that I'm clicking that Run icon. This is how the user would actually run this flow from the team site when they're ready. So they'll just come, they can see the list of all the different flows, and they click that play icon, and you can see that a new folder was created. If I were to drill into that, I would see those additional items. So what we're going to do next is talk about a few things that I learned when I made my flow. So the first one is that the OData query filters that you saw me use, where I did item number equals, you know, the variable that was passed in the first step, are case sensitive to the field names. And if you're not sure like what the actual field names are or what fields you have available when you're making an OData filter, what you can do is you can add \data and then another / and the actual name of your entity. So in my case, that was Release Products V2. And that will open up a page where you can see all of the fields and the sample data of your particular data entity. So you'll want to make sure that the case that you're using, uppercase and lowercase, matches exactly what you see in that OData endpoint. The second thing that I kind of, stumbled across was that there's no ability to rename a folder. There is a function out there to copy an entire folder. In my most ideal world, it would have been easier to just have one step where I copy the template folder. However, if I copy that template folder, there was no action out of the box to rename the folder. As a side note, if you're wanting to get really technical, it is possible, but to rename a folder, but you have to use HTTP requests and the SharePoint API, which is a little bit more complicated. So in my case, I created the folder, gave it the name I wanted it to have, and then I used the copy file action. The only downside to that is if you add more templates in later, you'd have to add another step into your flow to make sure that that additional template gets copied. When you're creating the flow directly from the team site, it takes a while for that flow to show up. So if you just created a flow and you're testing it out, you went back to your files tab and then you go back to the flow tab and your flow isn't there, you're like, where is it? Just wait. There's some caching things that happen. And it just takes a little while before it will show up over in that flow tab. So if your flow seems like it just went MIA, just wait a few minutes, refresh your screen, and it'll show up. The next thing is like you can't use the get record, and I shouldn't say without a rec ID. It's the object ID is really the technical term. In my case, if you don't know what that object ID is, one tip if you want to use get record instead is to just run the flow and let it give you the error message. In my case, I decided to use the list items present in table, and then I filtered it down using that OData filter. The next thing that you might run into is that you cannot initialize and set a variable inside of a loop. The loop was created in my case because I used the list items present in table, and that always draws the assumption that I have multiple records. Like I said, you can use the first expression and limit that down so that you only have one variable when you do the set variable, but if you do have a loop, then you'll need to initialize it as one step and then set it as another step. And then the the last tip is that you created your flow, but you go back to Power Automate and you can't see your flow. You can't find it. It's not in the My Flows list. The reason for that is that it goes over into the team flows. So it's the second tab over. So the other thing to note is that it doesn't use the environment that you're like selected on. When you make a flow from a team site, it will always put that into your default CDS environment. And your default CDS environment might have been renamed. In my case, it's been renamed to Personal Productivity. And it is actually a best practice to rename that default CDS. So you'll have to switch to whichever environment is your default and click on the Teams tab to see those. So the next example that we're going to talk about is using OData actions. There are a lot of different scenarios that use OData actions. You've actually already seen one, and you may not have even realized it when Chris did his demonstration with the workflow. That template has an OData action in it that actually completes the workflow. Another example that we talked about in the Part 1 series was using an OData action for approving a bill of material. There are a variety of OData actions available out of the box, but you also have the ability to create custom OData actions. So to make a custom OData action, it will require a developer. And so if you have an existing entity that you want to extend, or you want to make a brand new entity, you can create custom OData actions that call any code and perform any sort of action inside of the system. And in order to do that, really the key thing here is that you'll need to decorate that method that you create with the sys OData action attribute. Those OData actions can optionally take parameters as well. It's not required, but it's very common. And the list of parameters that you get is dynamic. So the execute action step inside of Power Automate will automatically show all of those parameters inside of Power Automate when you create that. So the basic steps are to create that flow, make a connection to the Dynamics 365 FinOps connector, and then you choose the option to execute action. You'll choose the instance, pick the action you want from the drop-down box, and you'll enter those additional attributes as required. So for my example, I'm actually going to be showing you how to make a scheduled flow. And in my case, I'm doing a very simple example with a data management package that I'm exporting. You could use a very similar process. I'm doing a mobile notification to indicate that the file was exported, but you could also use this flow to do the full orchestration of the file as well. So let's go ahead and switch over. I'm here in Power Automate, and we'll start this video. And what I'm going to do is click on flows, and then I will click to create a new flow and choose scheduled from blank. You'll give your flow a name, and then you can select the frequency that you want your flow to run. So I'm starting it basically immediately and setting it to run every 1 hour for this example. If you create it and you're like, oh, I want to change that, you can always reopen that flow and change the interval, the frequency, the time zone, or the starting time. Then I add a new step and I connect to Dynamics 365 and choose execute action. I choose the environment I want to connect to. And in my case, I'm going to use, like I said, that data management. So I start typing and I get down there and I choose the option here to export to package. It's not uncommon sometimes when you're using those execute actions that you might get a temporary error message. Once you pick the action, that error message should go away. So I'm indicating which definition group ID. This is the name of the project inside of finance and operations that you want. And then you give it a package name. That's the package name it will use. And then what I'm doing is I'm parsing the JSON. In my case, I'm taking the output of that execute action because it will give me the full name of the package that's exported. You can see it there in the value. So I'm copying in that sample schema. If you don't have your sample schema, the easiest way to get it is to just test your flow, run it once, and then you can copy and paste that from the flow run. In my case, I'm doing a mobile notification here and indicating that the value has been exported. I could be much more sophisticated with this and do a lot more steps, but when I'm ready, I can test that flow, click done, and then you can see it's running. It's now sent that notification. What I'm going to do is switch over to finance and operations. Every time this runs, you can actually see in the data management workspace that that data package has been executed. So you can see the project, and we'll drill into that project here in a second, but you can also see it in your job history over on the right, and you could click execution details there, or you could scroll back over, and what I do is I open up the actual project. And here you can see the details of it. You can go to the job history of just that one, so you can see every time it's been running. And if you look at the execution details there, you can see the full details. And if you wanted to manually re-download that package, you could re-download it again. With that flow, if I wanted to actually orchestrate the file, there are additional OData actions that you can use to do that process. So a few things that I learned when I was making this flow. The first thing is that in my case, my scheduled flow only runs hourly, and I don't want to sit there and wait for an hour to see if my flow run works. So you can always use the test feature, or you can manually run the flow by clicking on the run icon or the play icon on that particular flow. Otherwise, if you set it up to, and don't feel like you need to temporarily set it up to run every 1 minute, because you can just run it ad hoc as well by clicking on that play icon or clicking on the test on your flow. You know, the next one is there's no JSON. Like, I don't know what my JSON looks like from that previous step. The easiest way to do that is to run your flow once without the parse JSON step in it. And then you can go to your flow run history, and you'll be able to see the JSON message in either the body or the output, whichever section you're wanting, and copy and paste that. There was a question earlier that had come up in the Q&A panel of like, when do I need to parse JSON? You need to parse JSON anytime there's a JSON message that has a value in it that you want to be able to pick out. And what parse JSON does is it takes that whole entire message and basically makes like a variable, if you will, for every single element in that JSON. Another tip here is if you have unknown parameters for the object ID, if you're using a get record is a great example, is that, again, run the flow, and it will actually give you an error message. You'll need to pass at least one value in because the object ID is always required. So stick a value in there. You could just type ABC, and then run the flow. And when you go look at your execution history or the job history, it will actually give you an error message and say, oh, you need the data area ID and the BOM ID, or whatever that message might be. And so that'll give you those additional details. And make that process easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it back over to Chris, who's going to talk a little bit about how we can use custom business events with Power Automate. Chris?
Hi, Rachel. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a question in the Q&A that I thought I'd mention. So Rachel just showing custom actions. Now I'm going to be talking about custom business events. It's also possible to use custom data entities within Power Automate. So all three of those options are available to you. So in the earlier examples, we looked at responding to business events from workflows and alerts. There's also a set of application business events provided out of the box centered around the procure to pay and order to cash scenarios. These are listed in the business events catalog or directly in Power Automate when setting up that when a business event occurs trigger. You can see the list of events fully listed there. And you can also, you can always create business events for any application scenarios that we might have missed. Or if you have, partner code or customer code that you ship, you can ship business events with that code. I should also mention a new business event related feature on the roadmap for the Common Data Service, which will expose the finance and operations business events and virtual entity data change events via the native CDS. Rachel, you got something on screen there. The native CDS current environment connector. You can join the preview, the private preview of that to get a look at those new features if you're in the Insider program. Great, so let's look at the next slide. Great, so if you want to create a custom business event, it's just a matter of doing 3 things. It's very straightforward. 1, build the contract. 2, build the event. 3, add code to send the event. So to build the business event contract, you create a class that extends the business events contract class. It defines the payload or data provided by the business event. You can see that in the top left corner there. To build the business event, you create a class that extends the business events base class. You can see that in the top right corner. The example code shown here is from the developer documentation linked on the previous slide. In this example, the sales invoice posted business event contract is defined. The sales invoice posted business event is defined. And then there's just that single line of code down the bottom left corner to send the business event with its sales invoice payload. As I mentioned, these custom business events can be placed anywhere in your application code where a significant event occurs. And once the business events are defined and firing, then you can take advantage, then you can take a break from the code and join your citizen developers in defining Power Automate flows that are triggered by those new business events. So all of those custom business events are available to your makers inside of Power Automate to build the flows that they wish to create. All right, back to you, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. So in our last example, we're going to talk about using scheduled flows with Power Automate. There are a variety of scenarios and examples where you can use scheduled flows to help, make a business process more efficient. So some of the examples that you see here are automating quality processes. So twice a day, you want to create new quality order tests, or every hour you want to update the quality order statuses. We'll actually be taking a look at an example very similar to that when we do our Part 4 session in a few weeks when we do UI flows. Some other examples are automate month-end processes. It's not uncommon that finance teams will have very repetitive tasks that happen during month-end. So one example is to copy all of your month-end checklist items from the financial period close workspace out to a team site or to a planner on a specific day of the month. Or we might want to automatically perform an action. So I might want to run a particular report, or I might want to copy data or post journals on a specific date and time. You can also use them to process a list of items. So checking credit limits and then sending those out to the sales reps as an email notification, or checking the status of your journals once per week, or reminding your employees that they need to post their timesheet at the end of each day. There are so many examples of this, and I invite you all to use the Q&A panel right now to share with us what are some of the processes that you do or that your customers do on a regular basis that you would like to automate. So type those responses into the Q&A panel, and then we'll share those as they come in. We might wait until after Marie's demo, but I encourage you to go type those in. Some other examples is like renewing vendor certifications. A lot of industries require their vendors to maintain certificates, and they might have expiration dates. So you could automate the process of reminding those vendors to do that. Collecting updated W-9s. So, we need to get those new W-9s on a regular basis from our vendors. So signing out those emails and giving them a mechanism to send those back to us, and then attaching them into the system automatically. Signing new terms and conditions is another fantastic example, or any really kind of policy change. And this could be related to vendors or customers or even your employees internally from an HR perspective. You might also have like a weekly or monthly report where you want to list the records present in a table, and then format or summarize those details into an email. So again, I encourage you put some ideas or processes that you would like to. Yeah, we had another someone submitted one reminding employees to submit timesheets. A fantastic example. Keep them coming. Another one just came in: import products from Excel. Import and update those items, and then inform customers when they're created and ask for more information from the customers. So it's another fantastic example of how you could use Power Automate to do this. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Murray, who's going to do a demonstration.
Yeah, and this example that we have here is a simple example, but what it does is it shows how you can go out and use a recurrence. And in this case, I'm going to run this this process every week. So I'm just running this once a week so that I can get a summary, but I could run that monthly or hourly, however I want. But what I can do is I can go out, and in this case, I'm going out and getting all of the customer records, but I'm filtering it out just on the customers that are on hold. And then once we've got that, we have all the table data. We can create an HTML table. I can pick up my profile. And then also what I can do is I can send an email through a service account and then just paste in that HTML. So this is, rather than sending this from a particular user within the organization, this is now coming from Dynamics. It's going and querying the data, and it'll create the email and send it to me. And if I go over to my email, then you can see that I now have all of my customers that are on hold, but it's been formatted as HTML, and I received that notification right away. So this is actually a really simple example of automation, but we're going out and we're creating reports that are sent out through email. We're not using anything except for just the standard Power Automate functionality. And we could automate these and just have them being sent out every day, every week, whatever we want to do, or send it out to customers or vendors as well. So that was a quick example of just one of the scenarios that we scheduled, and in my system it just runs every week.
Thanks, Murray. So that wraps up the demos and what we wanted to share with you today. I do want to encourage you to make sure that you're registered for the upcoming sessions in our series. In part 4, like I said, we're going to be covering the UI flows, and that's happening on October 7th and 8th. And then the next 3 parts in the series are going to be focusing in on Power Apps. Those are happening later in October and into November. So please, I encourage you all to, join us and get registered for those sessions, and the link to register for those is down at the bottom. And we'll open it up for Q&A at this point. I see that we had some more examples come in and a couple questions. So a couple more examples that came in from people. Workflow approvals, mid and end probation review, and price agreement renewals. Thank you. Those are some fantastic examples. Another one came in for creating purchase requisitions in F&O. So great. Thank you for that suggestion. All right, so now it looks like we've got a couple of questions. So we've got one, I think, for Chris. Someone asked, can I say that the native D365 F&O workflows will be replaced by Power Automate? Chris, can you take that one?
Yeah, so this question came up yesterday as well. We're working on making it so that Power Automate can extend finance and operations workflows. We're not looking to replace the finance and operations workflows at this point. We want, as I showed, you can extend them today, extend the finance and operations workflows today, so that you can do approvals in facilitated by Power Automate. We want to make it so that you can do more extension. We also want to make it so that you can do approvals solely in Power Automate rather than going to the finance and operations predefined workflows. Yeah, we want to kind of create a whole ecosystem of workflow options for you.
Thanks, Chris. So we had another question come in. Can F&O event trigger a flow now? Yes. The business events in finance and operations are what are required in order to trigger a Power Automate. Some new functionality is coming soon as well in the future that Chris talked a little bit about for the business events being surfaced in Power Automate, as well as the virtual entity CRUD actions being enabled as a possibility to trigger. And that kind of plays into another question that came in that someone was asking about what advantages do virtual entities have versus the entities in the F&O connector for Power Automate. And that's a great question. So the virtual entities, as of right now, do not support triggers for CRUD operations. And so that is something that's coming with these new business events and those additional features, which will give us that flexibility that we can have a trigger and say when a record is created. That's functionality that exists today for the common data service and customer engagement applications, but does not exist for F&O. One big difference between using the F&O connector versus a virtual entity connector, and I don't know, Chris, is probably the OData actions. Are OData actions available on a virtual entity, or would you still need to use the?
Yes. No, those are available today. So with the CDS, with the finance and operations virtual entities in CDS, you can do data operations and you can call the OData actions, including the custom OData actions that Rachel mentioned. And then the work that's going on now is to expose all of the data events for those virtual entities out through CDS as well. So you'll be able to get those create, update, delete events via the CDS current environment connector in the future. In addition to piping the business events from finance and operations through to CDS, so that those come out as well through the CDS current environment connector.
So a question came in, why are you choosing to use Power Automate rather than a logic app? The last demo might as well have been a logic app, correct? My concern is in regards of Power Automate is deployment, application lifecycle management, how to make sure that our flows are being deployed to all environments without having to set them up in each environment.
Wow, that's a loaded question.
So it's like 4 questions altogether.
Yeah. So Power Automate is built on logic apps. It provides some capabilities on top of logic apps. Yes, you could create a number of these demos using logic apps or Power Automate. Power Automate provides a really nice maker experience, enables you to kind of leverage that citizen developer resource that you have in your organization, so that the subject matter experts can go ahead and build automations directly. There's a lot of capabilities being put into Power Automate right now with regards to deployment and application lifecycle management, moving those flows across environments. I'm actually, as of 2 months ago, the PM in charge of that now. I'm the PM for administration and lifecycle scenarios in Power Automate. We just last week, I think it was, released the connection references capability as a public preview, and I mentioned that I put a link to the blog post related to that in the Q&A. And we're working on environment variables so that you can use environment variables really easily inside of flows, so that when you move those flows between environments on import, the administrator will be prompted to provide connections for all of the connection references and provide values for all of the environment variables to make sure that the those environment variable values and the connections are associated with that environment rather than the old environment. So we're doing a lot in the application lifecycle management space to further empower the use of Power Automate.
And I also posted a link into the Q&A panel as well for a tech talk that focuses in on ALM for the Power Platform. So I encourage you to watch that. There is a very strong ALM story. It's been used for CRM and the customer engagement apps for quite some time. That is the same story and a lot of great information and tips that you can get from that tech talk as well.
There's another question here about if I create a flow based on a business event and somebody else triggers the business event inside of finance and operations, will your flow execute? Yes, it will. If yes, which users' credentials are used for that connection? So it's whatever connection information is set up inside of the flow. Yeah, so you want to make sure that the connection information is set up appropriately. You can see if you look at the documentation around the handling workflow, facilitating work item completion in Power Automate, you'll notice there's some commentary in the documentation about connections, setting up the connections correctly, and yeah, the templates might help you in that regard as well, kind of lead you down the right path.
Someone had also asked for the link for the upcoming events. I will paste that in as well for you here for the rest of the series.
There are also a couple of questions about performance in flows. So there is a capability to run flows with concurrency. So basically it means that pieces of the flow can be run in parallel, run concurrently. That's something that you should be careful with. It can improve the performance of the flow, but if any pieces of the flow need to kind of run sequentially, such as like putting a record in and then calling an action on it, you want to make sure that that concurrency stays off. The concurrency is just available via the ... and settings on the actions that you'll see within the flow.
All right, I think that wraps up the time that we have for today. So we'll go ahead and hand it back over to AJ. I do want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you on part 4 in a few weeks.
Thank you, and I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel, and I would like your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. Take us a couple minutes. We do appreciate your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are.